the return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Hey, it worked.
Well, you can probably see I'm not Frank McKenna and he's not Jim Hancock. Today, it's me, Joe Phillips, and Kevin Johnson in charge of the Downtown Den Politics podcast because Frank and Jim are away. We don't know whether they've gone away together. We don't want to start an ugly rumour, but you can draw your own conclusions. Anyway, I can assure you that Kevin and I can cover most of the things that have been exercising the political minds and things that we can rant about, approve of, or otherwise over the next hour or so. So, Kevin, you're joining us from Birmingham, obviously escaped the rats yet again. But let us start off with the big report out today, much trailed over the weekend, the report into Britain's water companies and the water industries. And I have to tell you, as a lot of people know from listening to me bang on about this, I swim in the sea. And I haven't been able to for the last 3 days because of sewage dumps in the sea on account of heavy rainfall. And there's been a lot of coverage on this. And the sort of upshot is everything we know, the water companies are ripping us off, lining their pockets, haven't invested in infrastructure. But the real cult, if you like, according to Sir John Cunliffe, who's done this report, is actually the numerous competitors and looking at possible ways of sort of getting rid of what exists at the moment, namely Ofwat, and coming in with something else. What do you make of all of this?
Well, the first thing to say, Joe, is, two things really. One is you talk about a big report and coming from Birmingham. There's also a big report out this morning, the West Midlands Growth Plan, which we might turn to, and the Downtown have announced a Westminster parliamentary reception. So that's even bigger news in Birmingham. But turning to water, yes, for the last couple of years, I've done a job for Ofwat and the Consumer Council for Water, where I've been the independent chair of a series of public consultation sessions called Your Water, Your Say, which fed into what's called the price review. That's the process by which Ofwat set the investment levels and the bill levels for water companies, which came into effect in April. So I've spent the last couple of years trudging through the travails of the water industry and know far more than I ever wanted to know about the inner workings of the water industry. So today's report is interesting from that perspective. In the end, though, through all my work in the last couple of years, what I really, settled on was that much like the rest of the public sector, the water industry, albeit privatised, but as a utility, it's effectively serving the public, has not had the level of investment going into it to deal with a system which was built in the Victorian era. And really both investment levels have been held back through price controls, and the investment has been available has not been maybe spent as wisely or in the right areas that it might have been. And so today's report from John Cunliffe and his commission attempt to deal with that. What I would say, and there's 88 recommendations, the summary report alone, is 67 pages. So there's a lot to get through and a lot to think about. But what I was struck by was yesterday, the Environment Secretary, Steve Reed, saying on television, words to the effect that bill rises would not happen in the way that they just have ever again. I think that is a hostage to fortune. Whatever you think about the investors in the water industry, how the water companies have been run, how it's been regulated by Ofwat, by the Environment Agency, by the Drinking Water Inspectorate, what we all know is that industry needs more investment to deal with not only the problems of sewage and an outdated water system, but also because we've got growing population, climate change and a whole range of other factors which mean that the way in which we supply fresh drinking water and deal with sewage has got to radically change, and that requires investment. It's got to come from somewhere.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, you're absolutely right. It's not just water; it's everything. And while people go, "Oh, renationalise," that's the answer. Well, it isn't, because it's extremely expensive, and that would cost an awful lot of money as well. And then you've got to find the money for infrastructure. But we've heard Nigel Farage this morning talking about how he's going to build new prisons. Well, how are you going to pay for them? How are you going to pay for all the things that we know we need, whether it's prisons, schools, hospitals, more public sectors in health? And this, I suppose, is at the nub of what probably, and we'll come on to this a bit probably in the second half, over the summer holidays, over the recess, Keir Starmer will probably reflect on how did it all go so terribly wrong in many, many ways. But the problem he's got, and you illustrate it very well by alluding to Steve Reed, the Environment Secretary, you can't make promises that you don't know that you can keep. So you can't possibly say water bills will never rise. They probably will. They might not. One thing's for sure is they won't be going down. And there is this fundamental problem, I think, you might disagree, at the heart of British politics, which is the failure to recognise on the part of us, the electorate, if you like, that we can't have the things we want without paying for them. And I don't think, despite her best efforts to talk the economy down and destroy it single-handedly, I don't think Rachel Reeves' downbeat, but trying to be grown up at the beginning of this parliament, has helped. And I wonder how we get to a point where we're a bit more intelligent, we're a bit more sensible, and recognise we can't have something for nothing.
Yeah, and I think I would go further back, actually, Joe, and say that I think Labour made a strategic error in the campaign, in the election campaign leading up to just over a year ago, in giving the impression that taxes were not going to rise, working people's taxes, whatever they are, were not going to rise, when at the same time coming in and then saying we've got a £22 billion black hole, and we all know, whether it's water, whether it's social care, whether it's NHS, whether it's the planning system, a whole raft of areas of public life, of our public realm, of our public services, are in radical need of reform and radical need of investment. And the things that we want in life, whether that's a first-rate NHS system, whether it's better schools, and all the rest of it, these things don't come cheap. Not only to run them, but also to reinvest in them and to make them work, at least to a reasonable standard, if not the political phrase of all time, world class. And I think you say, Joe, that Labour's had a bad year. I think I would agree to some degree, and I agree with our great and glorious leader Frank, who lists, having been to the Labour sort of anniversary party last week, lists the many things they're doing. And you could say, I think, that reviewing the water system, albeit completely ruling out nationalisation, that's an example of the areas where they're trying to look at the long term and fix the fundamentals. But Steve Reed and saying it's all going to be milk and honey and you won't get another bill rise is kind of at the other extreme of that political challenge, really. I think, in sort of giving himself a hostage to fortune. The other thing I'd say, Jen, we might come on to this, is that you mentioned your good friend Nigel Farage, I know you enjoy spending time with. He's getting himself in a bit of a bind, isn't he? This is where he may begin to get unstuck, and I say only may, both on prisons and on his comments on the water sector yesterday. Being the sort of friend to everybody and saying, a plague on all your houses and I'm going to sort it out. The man of common sense is going to come in and sort things out. And then suddenly he's going to, half nationalise the water industry. He's going to fix the prison crisis with no real, view of how to go about not only the criminal justice system, but also about how do you stop offending and reoffending in the first place. That I think is maybe the seeds of some hope for Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, in that you've got oppositions which, when they get into the detail, are going to be flailing about and trying to, give everything to everybody, but to a degree, as Labour did going into the election, try and pretend that you're going to get it all for free or with no tax rises.
Yeah, and I think that, that underlines my point that all the time you've got politicians of, various hues saying we will fix this without saying how and what it's going to cost. We're never going to move on from this, and a part of it is, as we've discussed on this podcast many times, there is an intensely hostile press towards the Labour government, and Nigel Farage, as Frank would say if he was here, but I'll say it for him, Reform gets a disproportionate amount of media coverage, certainly compared to the Liberal Democrats and the Greens. But I think, all the time you've got people who, certain sections of the media say, oh, he'll sort it out or she'll sort it out. You're never going to be able to move on to a sensible grown-up conversation, which takes us neatly into grown-ups or not. What do you think about lowering the voting age to 16 and 17-year-olds?
Can't do a worse job than we've all done, can they?
Absolutely.
When it comes to democratic outcomes, I think I'm probably on the side of allowing it and supporting the proposal. They can pay taxes and do other things which have an impact on the sort of the public sphere, as it were, and therefore why shouldn't they have a say in how the public sphere is shaped, how our democracy is shaped, how civil society runs, etc. I think I've seen predictions that it will have, about a 3.5% increase in the total electorate, particularly when you take into account likely turnout. And I think it's probably a reasonable point, and we may touch on pensions today as well, Joe. It's a reasonable point to say that, obviously, older people, I could say that as a man in my mid-50s, that I can comfortably talk about older people a bit more now. Older people are probably having too much of an impact on the democratic system because they're out voting. Of course, they are far more than younger people who've got other things to do and don't get attracted by nerds like us. And therefore, things like, the pension triple lock will remain untouched because nobody wants to go there because that's where the votes are. So I think balancing out the electorate is probably a good idea. There's plenty of politically active and interested young people. I think they get charred as being sort of, not caring about the world or about politics. Actually, they care about issues. I'm saying that in a very generalised way, but young people, 16, 17 upwards, care about big issues, whether that's about environment or about diversity and inclusion or about poverty or whatever it may happen to be. They may not get as turned on by party politics and by the Westminster shenanigans, but they certainly care about issues. So let's engage them in the political process. I think there are probably bigger fish to fry in some of the proposals coming forward last week. Particularly around automatic voter registration and around the kind of proofs of identity, etc., that are or are not required when you turn up to the ballot box. I think they're potentially going to have a bigger impact than age reforms.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, as you, I'm sure, have read it from cover to cover. My best-selling book, Why Vote, which came out, and it was an updated version from the last election in 2010, but was aimed very much at young people because, young people, I did a lot of work with John Denham when he was at the Home Office on the Why Vote campaign. And one of the things that was absolutely astonishing, we set up a mock polling station and got lots and lots of kids to come in, and we even had some resting actors playing the role of the tellers outside with bright rosettes and all that stuff. But if you've never been into a polling station and you've never tried to wield one of those stubby little pencils and realise that you go behind a little, partition and you cast your vote, and it's all very old-fashioned and you stick it in a box, you might think, oh gosh, somebody's going to quiz me. I don't know enough. And I think there's some real basic schools from primary school, because if you take a group of 6-year-olds and say, okay, it's a rainy day, which film are we going to watch today? Hands up for, I don't know, Shrek, and hands up for Finding Nemo. They can work out the basics of who got most votes and that sort of thing. So it's not a very difficult concept. But I think if you engage people early on and you make voting just part of life early, so it becomes a habit. 16, you might well go and vote for Jeremy Corbyn. By the time you're 21, you might be voting for Nigel Farage. We all change. But I think with such a fluid and fickle electorate, it's more and more important that we get democracy working for everybody. And as you rightly say, Kevin, it's something staggering like 80% of people over 64 vote, whereas only 30% of people, not kids, but people under 40 vote. And that means, as you say, triple lock, never going to be touched. Look at the outcry over winter fuel. I mean, admittedly, that was extremely badly handled. But what about the stuff that really matters, about access to jobs, public transport, all of those things that will help shape young people's lives and help them decide where they want to go and how they're going to live, out of home, out of care, whatever it is. And that probably will take us on in a little bit to the West Midlands growth plan. But it's also about how what we've seen in the mayoralties with people like Andy Burnham, for instance, is actually you're designing jobs and courses for the skills and jobs that you need to fill in your area. So it's not just, I think I'd like to be a beautician, but I live in a town full of mainly 70-year-old men. I'm not going to get a lot of business. And I know I'm being sort of slightly facetious, but all of those things play into it. And young people need to be part of shaping the world, and we need to encourage them. I mean, personally, I would go one stage further and make voting compulsory, but I know that's not a popular view.
Yeah, I'm with you, to be honest. I would make voting compulsory. I think it should certainly be banned. Anybody who's not turned out to the ballot box should not be able to pontificate, whether that's in a boardroom or a pub, about what's going on with our politicians at Westminster. And as you might imagine, Joe, I've made my boys come with me to the polling station from a very young age, and I should declare an interest that certainly my eldest will almost certainly vote at the next election, and my younger one, 2.5 years, is junior. Under these proposals, will also be voting at the next election. So I've got a more than a passing interest in these proposals, but also it's that tie-up, isn't it, between, and this is almost going back to fundamental challenges that Starmer's had this year, is how do you correlate between turning up and popping your bit of paper in the ballot box, which is a process I love, by the way. I get great joy out of it, but that's how sad I am. None of this, online voting for me. Thank you very much. The whole business of turning up and dogs at polling stations. I love the whole British democracy. Yeah, it's exciting. But so my boys will not be. They will be almost used to it when they don't pay potentially at the next election. But I think getting that correlation between what has my vote done and what's happened, because I think it's too easy for people to say, well, my vote's had no impact, and politicians don't do anything, do they? But actually, if you look at any government, maybe we put aside some of the more recent governments and those that have only lasted a few days in recent years, but you look at any government, you can work out what they have done. Maybe they've not done enough, but what have they done as a result of people turning out and voting for them, right? And that's not sort of easy, as quick, as transactional as probably the rest of our lives we're now used to, being able to do everything and things arriving in an instant on the doorstep, etc. It is harder, but I think getting an early understanding of how that system works and the impact your vote has, and that one vote can really make a difference. And we saw in this last election just how close many individual constituency votes were. I think that's important, and embedding that early on, I think, is pretty important. And I think also, what I would say, Joe, picking up one of the things that you touch on there, is that it'd be quite interesting over time, wouldn't it, if you got 16, 17-year-olds voting, what impact will that have, for example, on further education, on policy around further education? When college goers, sixth form goers, young apprentices, whatever, are actually voting, what impact will that have on the policies that directly affect them, and then obviously going on into higher education for those people who go through that pathway? So I think it's a good thing, and the more people we get voting, the better. But I think probably we'll turn to this, I know, Joe, later. But the political parties and the leaders in particular also need to work out how they keep reminding voters what they've done, how their voters impacted the decisions that are taking place today. Yeah,
and I think the last election we've seen it. We know that the Labour's got a walloping majority, but they are wafer thin majorities in so many areas. So actually, you could argue that your vote counts more in the next election, probably, and certainly in the last one, than it did 20 years ago. I mean, you know, certainly where I live in those days, you could stick a blue rosette on a donkey, it would have been elected. And in fact, many were, as we know. And some of them were...
Name names, Joe. Name names.
But the other thing I think is really important, and I think this is where, you know, it's the correlation, but it's an area I've talked about, care very much about, which is local government, because it has a real impact on the day-to-day lives of people, and you can see it. And if you can encourage young people to get involved in that local level, they can see what's happening on their street, in their town, on their bus route, you know, all of those sort of things. And that it's easier to have an engagement actually with your local councillor who might live down the road than it is with your MP, where you've got to make an appointment or go on a trip round Westminster. Let us move on to something that was very, very big news at the end of last week, but has slightly been overshadowed by the water report and various other things. And it's one that is quite complex, and it's one that I think is easy for people. In fact, I was on GB News last week, and to my great horror, the presenter said, I don't care about this. It wasn't Nigel Farage, by the way. I don't think this is important. Why does this matter? And this, of course, is the leak of the data set through the Ministry of Defence, not deliberate, we understand, an inadvertent leak of a lot of names of Afghans who had worked with and worked for the Allied forces during their time in Afghanistan, but it also included names of spies and soldiers and various other people. And this bizarre super injunction, which people tend to associate with Premier League footballers to keep their extramarital shenanigans under wraps. If this is the first time, as far as I know, that a government has used this, and they used it to not only keep the leak secret, but to keep the fact that they had made it secret as well, which is an appalling, in my opinion, cover-up. You can understand, you know, a clampdown. We used to call them D-notices in the old days, as you know, from broadcasting. And you could say, all right, we're doing that for a few weeks whilst we try and sort this out. But this went on for 3 years, up until it was removed last week. And it was renewed just before the election in June last year by one Grant Shapps, who appears to be rewriting history about how it happened. But it is a terrible attack on democracy, isn't it?
It is, and maybe you or other listeners can point me to this, because exactly that phrase, you use a D-notice. I don't know why a D-notice was not used in this example. I'm not even sure it was used on a short-term basis, as you say, for 2 or 3 weeks. I think I'm also right in saying that the super injunction itself was imposed by the original judge, the first judge who heard the case. He decided a super injunction was might be necessary and sort of handy. I don't think the government of the day, pushed back on that, and I think I'm right in saying, don't be careful about the details and talking about a case like this. Labour under John Healey was pretty well probably the most respected cabinet member across the floor of the House, actually. He decided to keep it going. I think there is some, John Healey, I think, has been pretty good, but in a couple of areas he's been found wanting, and I think one of them is an answer to why he kept a super injunction going. Albeit, I think it was right. He undertook investigations. He appointed somebody, a respected civil servant, to look at the case, etc., and come back with recommendations. But it's gone on for a long time, and they pretty quickly decided to keep the super injunction, not just the injunction, going. But it is worrying. It is worrying for democracy. What I would say, though, is it's also testimony to a working media. Now, the media has been, constrained, and that's putting it lightly, in reporting on both the original data leak and then what's gone on since. But there have been sort of 4 or 5 journalists, not least Lewis Goodall, who's on a almost as successful podcast as this one, the news agents under the tutelage of the global media empire, but I'll also call him out because I think he's a cracking journalist, and he's also from Birmingham. But he and a few other journalists, including those on the Times, were the ones who found this and are the ones who've been continuing to go in and out of court on a regular basis, and reading and listening to what he's got to say about it is very worthwhile. So there remain big questions over this, but the media, although constrained, as I say, in doing their job originally, have done a fantastic job in once the injunction has been lifted and once the statement was made by John Healey, they've been able to tell the story of what's gone on right back, I think, until 2022, which of course is when I think that was the time before even the politicians were made aware of it. So there is a lot to learn from this example, from this whole episode. But we would say this, wouldn't we, Joe? But a shout out to the journalists who kept working. There was no return on their investment for years on end until they were able to report on it from in the middle of last week.
No, absolutely. And I think, we criticise the media, all of us, even those of us who, work in it, albeit, tangentially. But I think absolutely, it is only because of journalism that we knew about thalidomide, that we've got as far as we've got on the post office scandal, that we've got this, that we've got the blood scandal, miscarriages of justice, Andrew Malkinson, and so on and so forth. And you're absolutely right. There is no return. It's bloody hard work. It's boring. It's plowing through lots and lots and lots and being tenacious. And it's having editors who will say, all right, go on, you keep going. Yeah, you'll get there eventually. And sadly, media, like everything else, is very under-resourced, overstretched, and they're trying to get to the quickest thing, the clickbait, the Twitter feed, the outrage. So things like this are really, really important, because what struck me, and I think is the most horrifying thing, is that the members of the Intelligence and Security Committee, this is a highly esteemed professional committee who are used to seeing things that are dangerous or very secretive, but certainly would have an impact on national security. But the government of the day, and in fact this government, until they chose to lift the notice, the injunction, did not see fit to allow those people to see this information. And Lord Beamish, who used to be Kevin Jones before he went into the other place, is absolutely, apoplectic with fury. And understandably, what is the point of having these people who you trust to examine and scrutinise issues of national security if you then say, oh, but you can't see this because we don't trust you? I mean, it's absolutely shocking.
It is. I'm tempted to think, and let's see what comes out as this unwraps and as the ISC do actually undertake, and the Defence Select Committee do undertake their inquiries now into this. But I would imagine what we're going to find is that at the root of this sort of secrecy upon secrecy, which was covering up a lack of secrecy in terms of a data leak, what we're, I think, going to find is the attitude and the culture of certain officials in the civil service, and in this case in the MOD. And I'm not saying that on a blanket term for all civil servants and all public servants working in the UK, but I think probably what and Keir Starmer's alluded to this already once and slightly rode back on it. And of course, we've got the famous example of Blair and being sort of stabbed in his back and all the rest of it. How do you command a civil service to do what you need it to do to deliver on the political priorities of a government? And how do you make it operate in a modern sense, which is not turning as quickly as you possibly can to covering things up or layering things in too many rafts of regulation and planning and bureaucracy? And I think probably what we're going to find is that whilst understandable, the MOD pounced on this and tried to make sure that Lewis Goodall and others didn't report on it for good reason, which was authorised by the politicians. They didn't then know how to get themselves out, and probably were fearing about the consequences of working out why this leak happened in the first place, which probably is, of course, human error, but probably all down to a whole raft of system errors and poor IT and all sorts of other things and other poor controls. So I think it's probably going to lead us not only to issues around secrecy, open media, scrutiny by parliament, etc. It's also going to lead us, I think, into further debate around the conduct and certainly the culture of civil servants, not least those in the MOD.
Well, and also there is the other bit that sort of got slightly less coverage than the outrageous leak and the outrageous super injunction, was the idea, which I do subscribe to actually, that part of the reason to keep this super injunction going for such a long time was to cover up the secret relocation programs of Afghans at the same time as the last government was ramping up the anti-immigration rhetoric and promising to crack down and, you know, all the rest of it, and every immigrant's a bad one and whatnot. Meanwhile, you know, bringing in thousands of Afghans undercover, if you like. So, you know, you're then caught in the situation, if you look at it in human terms. Okay, you turn up in Birmingham, you're from Afghanistan, you used to be an interpreter working with British forces. Somebody says, oh, hello, Kevin. Oh, I gather you used to, you know, you're actually home from your homeland's Afghanistan. What are you doing here? Well, you're not going to, well, I was an interpreter working for British forces, are you? So you've got that sort of thing, which is, you know, if it wasn't so deadly serious, would be farcical. And you're absolutely right. You know, anybody who wants to know how the civil service works, do watch Yes Minister. It might be 100 years old, but it still rings true. And of course, it is said that Margaret Thatcher thought it was a documentary.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, we have to be careful not to cast aspersions on the civil service, because that's easily done. And I think
they are there to hold checks and balances on daft ideas as well.
Yes, they are. And I think probably you mentioned sort of Winterfield and so on earlier on, Joe. It's probably the case that Rachel Reeves was, you know, presented with a bunch of options by Treasury officials, which they present to every government, and she decided to choose that one without thinking through the full political consequences, or at least rolling the pitch for it. So I think there's, you know, that there are worries, and we may turn to this when we talk about party leaders, etc. There's quite a bit of talk at the moment, isn't there, about, you know, the communications function within government and some changes happening there. All of that, you know, there is there are worries about the cabinet secretary, because he chose not particularly a radical cabinet secretary. Keir Starmer, he had the choice of a new cabinet secretary. He went with a pretty safe option rather than a radical option. You know, as we've got questions and comments on party leaders, on political parties, more and more political parties growing, possibly, some parties changing leaders, all the rest of it. We do need to continue to look at, have we got the right kind of functioning civil service? Have we got the right kind of regulators, as we talked about right at the top of the show, Joe? All of these things are pretty important. We don't need to be negative. We don't need to have personality, clashes, as it were, with civil servants who are doing a great job. But the way our state is functioning is not optimal. And certainly part of the picture has to be how do we run a modern government? How do we run modern government services and regulators? And I think probably this latest episode with the MOD data leak is just another example of why change needs to happen underneath the surface as well as on top of it.
Let us take a break. I think we both need to go and check our doormats to see if there's a postcard from either Frank or Jim, or even proof of life if one of them's holding the other hostage somewhere or other. And we'll be back in a minute to talk about the suspensions in the Labour Party, reflections for the party leaders, West Midlands Growth Plan, and Kevin, something that we never talk about on this podcast because the others won't let me, but I know something very close to your heart, arts funding in the regions. We'll be back in a bit. Well, I didn't get anything from Jim or Frank. Did you, Kevin?
Well, no, I didn't get anything from Jim or Frank, and for many, many weeks, if not months, I've not seen signs of life before that anyway.
This may be the last time you and I are ever allowed to do this podcast, but we could always set up on our own. We could have a pirate podcast. Let us go back to some of the sort of difficulties facing Keir Starmer. And I completely get what you said and what Frank wrote last week on the anniversary. And we have said often on this, it hasn't all been bad. What he's achieved on the international stage is amazing in a year. Actually, Britain's got a reputation again, which was absolutely comprehensively trashed by Boris Johnson. But the suspensions of the welfare reform rebels, followed by the suspension of Diane Abbott, which was not to do with that, is somebody said that's a sign of weak leadership, which I thought was the most bizarre way to look at it. It's a sign of him being tough, isn't it?
I found it all very odd. I mean, I've got sort of conflicting views on it. I thought the timing was odd. To do it sort of, after the event, whatever it was, at least a week or so after the event. He's been making noises about, making friends with backbenchers, spending more time with them. He's been spotted spending more time with them after PMQs, as he really should have done from the beginning, I think. Because, looking after your party is almost as important as looking after Donald Trump. But so I found the timing odd. Slightly odd in terms of who chose. They sort of landed on 4, as you said before, the Diana, but separate episode. So I find it all slightly odd. Having said that, I've read and spoken to a number of people who say that we're a bit tired. Two things, really. One is we're a bit tired of these MPs who haven't quite worked out that they've moved from being an activist to being an MP. Mm. And they're there to sort of serve the government and to make put the Labour plan into action, into legislation and so on. And I have some, not entire, but I have some sympathy with that. And also, and I do understand this, if you're a loyal MP who had issues over whether it's about benefit cap or about changes to universal credit and PIPs and so on, but you have been voting for it and you haven't been organising against the government, and you haven't been off either on or off the record talking to the media about how dreadful it was, etc. And then you see that you then don't get your legislation through that you've been backing, and there is no penalty for those people who have been campaigning against your own government. I understand that. I understand almost from a human point of view, never mind a political point of view, that you'd say, well, why am I being so loyal and covering up really some of my innermost feelings and giving myself issues either with my sort of campaign groups or my constituents, and all these guys getting away with it. So I understand it. I thought timing was slightly odd. He's right from the off. He had about 7, didn't he, when early on he got rid of 7 and removed the whip from 7 MPs. Some of them still don't have that whip back. So he's not been shy of removing the whip from MPs, but really what good it does in the end, given the stonking majority he's got, I don't know. I think I'd be, and I know Frank takes a slightly different view to me on this, I would be spending more time with my backbenchers and understanding them. I'd make sure that I don't allow what happened over the welfare bill to happen again, which is what he was getting advice and intelligence and input to say, this is, tricky with the backbenchers, and you're going to have a major uprising against it, and really did nothing about it, and then used the excuse he was busy abroad and didn't really notice it until 2 days before. I'd be spending more time with them, and I'd be thinking, what can I use them to do? They'll all be doing good constituency work, all be doing good campaign work, good select committee work, whatever. But also, how do I utilise this big number of MPs, not only to get my legislation through, but to make sure that they are engaged in the story and the vision of this government, and that they are usefully employed, particularly some of these MPs who have very good track records in their own sort of fields and their own areas of expertise. How do I make that work for the government, for the party, and obviously for the country?
Well, and I think this goes back to what we were talking about in the first part of the podcast. It's this relationship between our elected representatives and us, the electorate. If you are a constituency MP, maybe newly elected, maybe perhaps, as you say, you were an activist, you were very vocal, now you're having to make difficult decisions, and all you get in your surgery, in your inbox, is people going, please don't take away my PIP benefits. Isn't it incumbent upon you as part of a government to be able to put the argument to those constituents and say, we can't afford it, we're going to reform it, we're going to get rid of the telephone and online applications, we're going to bring back this, we're going to do this, that and the other, because, whilst 4 out of 5 of you do not claim, and therefore are paying for the 1 out of 5 that do claim, it's not fair on them. And it is this thing about being able to have a conversation about trade-offs. And I think in a way that goes back to what you were saying about civil service, that the link between the Prime Minister or number 10 and the parliamentary party is multi-layered. you've got the whips, and the whips will have been very well aware of the disquiet and the discontent. But how far did that get to Downing Street? Did they get rebuffed by Morgan McSweeney, who sort of said, well, sod them, they can do what they like and we'll suspend them? Or did it actually get as far as the Prime Minister or Angela Rayner have come to that, to say, hang on, look, you need to do a little bit of, Frank's right, you don't expect to have tea with the Prime Minister every single day just because you're a Labour MP with a 300 vote majority. But there does need to be that sense. And Tony Blair had it, if you remember. In his first year, he was spending a lot of time abroad. He was a lot of time on the world stage. And there was disquiet, there was discontent, there were rebellions and so on and so forth. But I think there is this feeling, if you think you're only going to be a one-term MP, do you want to court popularity with your constituents? Well, what's the point? Because you're never going to reform anything. Or do you want to actually try and change things properly and say, well, we can't have everything. You want a new road, but you want to keep the bus stops there and you want the children's playground. Well, something's got to give. What are you prepared to do? Because isn't that part of the job of an MP, which is to engage with your constituents and get them engaging with each other?
Yes, yeah, I think so. And probably I think this cohort of MPs are probably more engaged with their constituents than in the past to some degree, partly because some of the wafer-thin majorities, partly because of communication methods, some good, some bad, benefits of social media, etc. I think more people are out there, campaigners and so on, people in constituencies are more aware maybe of how to influence their MPs and what effect that may have. So I think probably this raft of MPs, and particularly on the Labour backbenches where there's so many people who are not sort of employed in government roles or on select committees or wherever else, or with other sort of spurious, bizarre titles or whatever, they are probably a bit closer to their constituents, and we know so more, don't we, through so much more polling and data and so on, and so many different kinds of media outlets and more kinds of outfits, policy and outfits and so on. They're probably more aware of what their constituents care about and what's affecting their lives. So we've got a very different set of politicians, I think, and people who've come from all kinds of backgrounds, including running think tanks, etc., and other campaigning outfits. So I don't think the effort. What we know about Morgan McSweeney is a bit like some of his other predecessors in similar chief of staff roles. Is that he's a great political campaigner, a great political strategist. What he's not, it would seem, is a very good strategist at party management and sort of political direction from a sort of an internal perspective. I think he probably had a very big hand in making sure they had Labour MPs, prospective MPs, who weren't going to give him too many problems, but actually what's happened is he's got people who are quite able, quite articulate, quite well connected. He hasn't got sort of nutters coming through, as may have happened in the past. He's got people who are, know their stuff in certain areas and are going to stick with it. So, one of the big things when Keir goes away and, lies on a sun lounger for half an hour over the summer is, thinking about party management is just as important as electoral planning.
Very briefly, your thoughts on Diane Abbott? Inevitable?
I think inevitable. I mean, it's sad, isn't it? I think it's very sad that somebody of her stature, with what she means, really, in the political system, in terms of being a black MP, etc., and been there for so long, being the mother of the house, it is sad to see because she's not really sort of making any sense really in that latest argument, is she? Where she's apologised for something, the wrong version got emailed to the Observer or whatever it was in the first place, but then she's apologised for that and now says, no, I'm not really apologising, I believed in it all the time. And she's far better placed than me, certainly, and probably you would say you, Joe, to talk about racism from a personal perspective. But when you get into, whether racism against people of her heritage, and the kind of issues that people from a Jewish background and practicing Jews have, both today and past atrocities and so on, when you're beginning to sort of compare and contrast and say one's worse than the other or whatever, I mean, it would be bad enough, wasn't it, if you were allowed to go onto that territory. It's not much better for Abbott to get herself in tied up in knots over that kind of thing. So it's sort of inevitable, I think. And she really, what I would say is, I don't think Keir Starmer handled it well before the election either. Letting that whole story run before she got the whip back and then was able to stand as Labour for so long. So, coming up to the election, okay, he didn't know it was going to be in July, but it was a possibility, of course. And I think and this has happened, isn't it, with a few other MPs, notable MPs who've disappeared from the Labour Party or fallen out with the Labour Party. He didn't seem to spend the sort of personal time with them. To just on a personal touch, he was a shadow cabinet colleague of Diana, but he doesn't. Clearly, they're from different sort of political perspectives within the Labour movement, but he didn't sort of spend time with her and deal with it on a sort of human level. And I think he's missed that trick a few times with different MPs. So I don't think that's great either. But unfortunately, I think probably inevitable. I don't know how this time it gets brought back and Diane Abbott brought back into the Labour fold. And, she's not quite the force that she was. Let's put it that way. But she's not somebody you want outside the tent either, is she?
No, and, because of her long service and, when you think of the abuse and the hatred and the vilification that she's endured over decades, as a black woman, a black MP, and the fact that she's been re-elected time after time after time, so she must be doing something right for her constituents. But it is a shame because this will be the end of her career. Whereas, if she just managed to not say anything silly and repeat something that made the apology sound completely insincere, she probably would have gone to the House of Lords, and I can't see how that can happen now. So it is a bit of a shame. Let us move on to local things first, because you want to talk about West Midlands Growth Plan, which I know absolutely nothing about.
Well, and not to say that I'm any expert on it either, as it's only been launched today, but I thought worthy of mention. We've seen.
You like to break the news here, Kevin?
Well, breaking news. Yeah, on a podcast people will listen to 4 days later. But yes, is Monday, by the way. The West Midlands Growth Plan being launched today, which is our sort of version of the industrial strategy, if you like, and it sinks in, aligns with the industrial strategy and the sector plans that the government has been rolling out over the last few weeks, including the financial services one last week. And these things have sort of been happening for a while. They used to be called, you'll remember this, Joe, in the era of regional development agencies. There were regional economic strategies, and we've had all kinds of versions, both under RDAs, under the local economic partnerships and other various systems that we've had over the last 25 years. And this is the sort of latest iteration of that. But I think one thing I would just sort of point out as an area to watch is they're put up in lights, if you like. Not only that all these plans talk about business, they talk about supporting business, they talk about people, they talk about place. And this one's gone pretty big to say that, the story of the West Midlands, the story of the West Midlands economy and everything that underpins it is sort of up there in lights as one of the things they're trying to fix. And basically, as we'll have touched on in this podcast before, the certain people in the Northwest, whether that's the good people of Manchester, good people of Liverpool, they're pretty good at talking up their achievements and their successes. And obviously London is almost another country. Birmingham and the West Midlands haven't been great at doing it in the past, or not as good as we might have done. And so they're making the story of the West Midlands economy and people telling that story. And this is an area which is pretty good at telling stories, not least as the home of Shakespeare. It's like outside the actual area, but never mind. We're pretty good at telling stories, and therefore we should tell a better story about ourselves and our economy and our hopes and plans for the economy. So that's going to be an interesting one to watch, not least, I think, when we see that at the top of that and the sort of chief architect of that plan, of course, is the current mayor, Richard Parker. And the last mayor, Andy Street, was, if he was nothing else, he was a pretty good storyteller. But she's still to resolve in the West Midlands, obviously. And Richard has made it, part of the sort of headline part of the plan is that storytelling is a big part of it. I don't disagree with that, but that's going to be an interesting one to watch.
So storytelling, this is marvellous. Honestly, you would think that you and I had worked in broadcasting before, because that segues into something that we don't talk about very often on this podcast, mainly because there's too many other things to talk about. but the role of the creative industries and the creative sector, particularly in regeneration. So where I am in Kent, I'm not very far from Margate, which has had mixed fortunes over the years, but is seeing something of a renaissance, largely thanks to the Turner Contemporary Art Gallery, which opened there about a dozen years ago now. But instead of the gentrification forcing local people out, which has happened to a little extent, what's actually happened is that different people have moved down, mainly from London, but they've moved down and they're settling here. So they're not like the people who are buying second homes in Cornwall, the Lake District, or Devon, or where I live. They're actually people who are living there, and that's changing the demographic. It's changing the dynamic, and it's giving a place a boost, a bit of culture. Dreamland, which you may or may not have ever attended on the back of a motorbike, or indeed driving a scooter with one of those parkers and the tiger tails. All of those things have a huge role to play. Morecambe, for instance, very, very important. The stuff that's happened in Liverpool, well, we're always talking about Liverpool, same with Manchester, but there are areas, and as you say, the West Midlands, the Black Country, has got a lot of story, a lot of creative heritage, but it doesn't get the coverage it deserves, except when people are going, oh, we need more money.
Yeah, that's right, and there is work going on here. I seem to remember Lisa Nandy, the Culture Secretary, has announced that there's work going on looking at the work of the Arts Council and how arts funding works. I did some work years ago on the back of a report which looked at the kind of the enormous amount of money that is going into London-based national organisations and London organisations in the capital, which were consuming enormous amounts of public funding for the arts, and elsewhere, not least in Birmingham or West Midlands, missing out. And that has been, here's a phrase from a few years ago, there has been some rebalancing going on in terms of arts funding, but there's still a way to go. And like in many things is, what is the right mix between public funding, private funding, where the arts goer, if you like, the cultural consumer, how much do they pay? How much do sponsors pay? All of this, there's a rebalancing all of that going on, but far more work is to be done. But I think probably now policymakers, including in respect of the West Midlands Growth Plan, policymakers begin to understand more, the value of the creative industries in general terms as an industry in its own right, of course, which is something we can claim to be pretty good at in this country, but also in particular arts and culture, and how much that has the role that has to play, both in a sort of social fabric point of view, from a economic point of view, and also just as a kind of the building blocks of place, having that sort of both the cultural infrastructure and then things that come along, festivals and so on, and other events that come along. I think that is getting some better play into industrial strategies, growth plans, and other parts of the sort of policy making sphere. That is all to the good. Interesting you say this today, Joe. I'm off this evening. This is going to give people an awfully incorrect impression of me, but I'm off to the opera this evening. Because not very far from where I actually live is Garsington Opera, which is a fabulous opera. And because of doing some work in a sort of cultural world, and I'm going along with a good friend of mine who's very much in that world. But this is something which you would think is beyond the masses, something which you would think was incredibly expensive, and it can be. But there are schemes, and there are discount offers and so on, and pricing schemes which make sure that people can attend these things without having to pay an absolute and utter fortune and turn up in ridiculous looking cars and outfits. So all of these things, whether it's opera, whether it's a bikers festival, whatever it is, all of these things should be available and accessible to people, and with whatever sort of background you come from, whatever music you might normally listen to, whatever plays you might attend or not, whatever books you read or don't. We should all try different things. We should all be able to access different parts of the cultural sphere, try different things, and pricing schemes and that happen. And the role of, people who, your friend Nigel or others who might say that the public sector government has got no role to play in these kind of areas, that, the market should always win out. I think this is an area, arts and culture is an area which proves that the public sector, in however way you shape it, the public sector has a role to play in investing in and making arts and culture accessible for everybody.
Well, and one of the best examples of that is the National Theatre on screen, which I think is absolutely brilliant. So instead of having to schlep to London to the National Theatre, you can go to your local cinema or your local theatre, and for a tenner or 12 quid, you can see the best productions that have been on in London, and you get a much better view, in my opinion, because you can actually get you've got camera close up, so you can see people's expressions. And it means you can do things like, I've taken my granddaughter to see loads of things, but we'd never have spent the money and the time going to London hoping that we could see behind a pillow, and hear next to the loud Americans and the rattling box of Maltesers. But that's another bugbear. Right, you've got to go to the opera, so you've got to get, well, maybe you haven't got to get, what is the opera you're going to see?
No, there you go. You've caught me out there, Joe. I can't remember which one we're going to see.
It's all right, we'll get you to sing a well-known bit next week when you're back on.
I tell you what, that really would be the last time I appear on this podcast.
I don't know. It might work for pet calming or something like that. Well, you can tell us what opera it was.
Yes, indeed.
When you've been. Let us reflect then, as MPs begin to break up this week and disappear on holiday. What do you think would be, for each of the party leaders, what should they be reflecting on over the summer?
Well, should we start at the top, I suppose? Do you know the thing I'd do most? Have a good rest. I think every human should make sure they have good rest, and we probably don't do enough of it because we're always on, aren't we, with the kind of nature of the world today and digital devices and so on, and the sort of immediacy of life as we know it. I think he needs a good rest, and he hasn't really had many opportunities to have that because crises have come along. His brother died and curtailed one holiday, etc. So I think he needs a good rest. I genuinely do think that, and everybody deserves a good rest. But if I was to reflect on anything, if I was him, we can wax on about stories and the importance of having a story. We all agree with that on this podcast, those present and those absent. But I think the other thing I'd be doing is looking at party and looking at the machinery of government, as dull as that sounds. How can he make sure that the party and the civil service and the sort of wider public sector is lockstep with him in delivering the kind of reforms, but also the day-to-day successes that people want out of their government. And I think he's done some very, very good work. There's some very good long-term planning and thinking going on. We touched on how good he's been with Trump, although that could explode at any moment. But I think a bit more work is required on not only the story, as we all agree on, but also on how does he make the party and the civil service deliver successfully and deliver a bit quicker.
And Kemi Badenoch, go and pick a fight with the Sun Lounger?
Dear, oh dear, oh dear. I mean, where to start? I thought she was slightly better at PMQs last week, although it was very obvious that she didn't go anywhere near the MOD crisis that we talked about earlier.
And she hadn't turned up to the briefing that she was invited to in March.
Well, I mean, that is and it's not the first time, is it? She's been offered security briefings on Privy Council terms and not taken them up very quickly. Diego Garcia being the other particular example. I mean, that's to me laziness. So I think, notwithstanding what I said about all political leaders and all of us as people need a good rest, while she is lounging on a sun lounger, I think it'd probably be about being a bit less lazy when she gets back.
No, blimey, okie dokie. Ed Davey, jumping on the sun lounger.
Well, I mean, you don't really need to give any advice to Ed Davey for a summer holiday because he's going to be on a water slide, isn't he, surely? Or he's going to be at a canoe or whatever. I mean, whatever he does, water and sun-based, he's going to have a camera crew somewhere near him, isn't he? Because he can't help himself. I think, broadly speaking, he's doing us, and you'll be much better placed to advise on this than me, given your background, but he's doing a pretty reasonable job, isn't he, given the circumstances. I think it will get, and he's pretty good at sort of rowing in with Starmer and saying the Tories are terrible, and then whether it's on spiritual care reform, whether it's on Trump, where a bit more freedom than Starmer or even Badenoch has. He can be pretty rude about Trump. That's going to get slightly more tricky as we, the next 4 years clock down. And he's got to make sure got his own space, and social care is a good space for him to be in. He's going to need other areas where there is clearly marked out Lib Dem territory, where it isn't about ganging up with Starmer against the nasty old Tories, or backing Starmer on some areas where they probably think very similar. He's going to need some more areas of distinction, but he's doing for a third party, he's doing pretty well.
Yeah, well, I think they're quietly providing a very welcoming environment and a welcoming home to disaffected Tories, the old One Nation Tories, if you like, who think that, under Kemi Badenoch and her predecessors, it's gone far too far to the right, and also picking up a few disaffected Labour people as well. The one thing that the Liberal Democrats have got is that they don't have to apologise for their stance on Europe. And there are many people who wish that now Keir Starmer would say, look, we're not going back on the referendum, we're not denying that result, but we do need a reset. And he's done an awful lot of it, but he's still tiptoeing. And I think many people, particularly in the business community, would really welcome a much more forceful, no, we are part of Europe, that's where our defence and security lies, and that's where our business must be. Albeit that I've got quite a good deal with Trump that may or may not implode at any moment, but I've also got one with India. And I think the thing about Ed Davey is, it certainly wouldn't have been the way I would have advised doing a publicity campaign, but he got the photographs and he chose two issues, social care and sewage. Well, sewage is on the agenda today. Social care still isn't, and that's a big hole in the government thing. And in a way, that goes back to where we were talking about giving young people the vote. They are going to have to pay for the people's care, who are now their parents today, or be their grandparents and so on in the future. So all of that is really important. Nigel Farage, take a rest, go to America.
That's like going home for him, isn't it, really? I think probably and we touched on this right at the top of the podcast, both on prisons and on water and sewage and so on. That's a little pointer to the future, isn't it? Nigel Farage, the most effective political communicator that this country has had since Blair, probably the most consequential politician in terms of the effect he had, although he didn't personally steer it, the effect he had on Europe, on Brexit, and riding high in the polls. But if you go around saying we're going to nationalise this, we're going to spend more money on that, if we're going to have 18-year-olds running county councils, the cows are going to come home at some point, aren't they? I think a little. I'm not saying it's all over. I'm not saying it's, he's going to be a busted flush by the time the next general election comes. He's a smarter politician than that. But he's been beginning to be found out a little bit, not only in terms of the problems of his party and people, moving away. He's lost 2 MPs effectively, hasn't he, just in the last few months for different reasons. But also that, storytelling, we'd like Keir Starmer to be better at. But you can't just be stories. You do need to have policies which add up, and he's certainly not got that. So I think a bit of adding up on the Sun Lounger. Yeah,
and also you can't be the Tory party Mark II, because all the people who were not re-elected last year, like Jake Berry, for instance, and Andrea Jenkins, well, if the public didn't elect you then, why are they going to elect you just because you're wearing turquoise instead of a different shade of blue? I think he's got to watch that. And the Greens, who get barely any coverage, but the most successful election for them for a long year, some really, really good people, but they don't get the a fair crack of media coverage, I don't think.
They probably don't get a fair crack of media coverage, and obviously they're behind Lib Dems in parliamentary strength, but they're sort of equal, arguably ahead of our good friend Nigel in terms of parliamentary strength now, given the losses that Nigel's had. But of course, they don't get anywhere near the same amount of coverage that Reform get. I can feel Frank walking back into this podcast by saying that. But and they've got a leadership election going on. I'm not a great fan of having two leaders. I mean, I understand the thinking of it, but it doesn't work, does it? I'm afraid.
And it's partly why you don't get the coverage. It's partly why You don't get, you want an interview, or which one of the co-leaders, well, you did, it doesn't work. You've got to come quickly. And you do need, whether we like it or not, you need to have a face attached to that party, that team.
And I think two things trouble me if I were the Greens. One is, given that the environment, climate change and so on is so important to many people, including the sort of 16 and 17-year-olds that we were talking about earlier on, because they've got a much longer view of the future than you and I have, Joe. Given how important the environment is for the Greens not really to be picking up the benefits of that, albeit we've got a pretty climate secretary. And secondly, we've got all this talk of, is Jeremy Corbyn and various others forming a new party of various independent people who are elected as independents, or people falling out of the Labour Party to the left of the sort of Starmer regime. And none of the benefits of this are going to the Greens in any way. All the talk is going to Corbyn and Sultana, etc. And there's a bit of talk about the Greens because they've got a leadership election, but not really. So I'd be thinking, they need a better political strategy which takes advantage of their absolute base, rooted in not just about environmental issues, of course, but that's the sort of the flag-bearing policy area, isn't it, for the Greens? And in this sort of increasingly multi-party system, with Lib Dems pretty strong, SNP not quite as strong as they were, but still a force, Farage, etc., and then this sort of rag tag of others that may form the party, may stay as some kind of loose, active alliance, etc. Where do they fit? How do they define A, their political territory, and B, stake out a kind of an area? As you say, Ed Davey's got social care and sewage. What are the Greens going to have? They don't even have the environment as their sort of issue which people turn to them on. So I think some pretty fundamental things for the Greens to think about, because they're not really taking advantage of the very impressive foothold that they've got in Parliament for the first time.
Well, I think we've raised the tone. We've got opera in, which is something that Frank and Jim and I have never managed, and I want to know all about it next week. Kevin, you and I will be back next week, possibly with Jim Hancock, if Frank releases him back into the wild, who knows. But thank you for your time, thank you for your company, and thanks to everyone for listening to the Downtown Den Politics podcast. Have a good week.